partners, both newsrooms, technology platforms, human rights organizations, academic institutes, and think tanks. Working together has its challenges, but actually by bringing together expertise from these different areas, we're starting to see some results. So I wanted to talk to you about one project called Crosscheck that we've been running in France during the French election. So it finished on Sunday. It was a 10-week attempt to monitor and track misinformation around the French election and to see whether we could collaboratively work together as a different set of newsrooms and academics to try and do something about it. So this was the blueprint. It did feel as complicated as that as we did it. The idea was that we brought in questions from the audience because we were interested to know what the audience were confused about. And sometimes it was this YouTube clip correct? Or it could have been a claim. Did Marine Le Pen actually say this? We also were monitoring social platforms. We were monitoring using CrowdTangle and NewsWhip and Google Trends to see what it was that was surfacing. And one of the biggest learning points for us is there is a tipping point. The news industry previously didn't have to worry about what was false. If it was false, it ended up on the cutting room floor. Journalism was about truth. The problem now is that audiences increasingly want help navigating the information ecosystem. But that leads to a real responsibility in terms of what do you give oxygen to. So during the Crosscheck project, there were times when we would see rumors or manipulated content circulating in certain Facebook groups, and we would see it staying in those Facebook groups, and we decide it was not responsible to actually debunk those claims. If, however, we saw them move from those Facebook groups into the mainstream, we realized that there was a tipping point, which is if we waited too long, the rumor would become embedded and we couldn't actually debunk it effectively. So as a news industry, this tipping point is something that we have to work out, and it's something that's a work in progress. So we saw this very much as a laboratory. Did we do more harm than good with Crosscheck? We don't know. We don't actually know if we worded the headlines correctly. We realized halfway through that our images were often what we were debunking, which when that ended up on Facebook, we were just reinforcing the rumor. We were reinforcing the fabricated content. We were wording headlines as questions. Halfway through, we realized that that was a problem. So for us, the reason we did this was because I've been to about 36 different fake news conferences in the last 6 months. And I said, we can't just keep talking about it, we've got to put something in the field, because now we have incredible amounts of data about who shared the debunks, what worked, what types of audiences we hit, what kind of information we debunked, was this systematic in terms of disinformation campaigns, and we wouldn't have known that if we didn't do it. So we had a site in both English and French. And for each story, as you can see, different news organizations cross-checked together. So one of the questions is, what audience is more trusting of the debunk because there were multiple newsrooms working on it together? Or did they think this was a mainstream media conspiracy? Which could easily also be the answer. And we used different iconography for manufactured or misleading or imposter. Here's some other examples. And each story was an attempt to explain how we'd done the debunk so we could be transparent. So lots of countries have now come to us and said, oh, we want to cross-check Pakistan. And I've said, okay, before we do this again, we need to make sure we test and we understand what worked and what didn't. So finally, looking ahead, the one thing that frustrates me about the conversations about fake news is it's often about text. And actually, what we should be thinking about is visuals. Our brains are much less likely to be critical of visuals. And things like memes that have now become weaponized on social networks is something that I am particularly concerned about and much more difficult to algorithmically filter. So this is a quote from This American Life. Oh, we might not have sound. Basically, they talk about
him into power. We shitposted our way into the future.
It's true.
This is true. This is true. Because we directed the culture.
So these were people at the Deplora Ball on the night of the inauguration being interviewed by This American Life, talking about shitposting their way or shitposting Trump into the White House. And their use of visuals and memes was quite astonishing in the lead up to the election. And if you look at Breitbart's Facebook page, what people share is all visuals and memes. When you look at somebody did a great piece of research about Breitbart Facebook page. Posts are shared a lot by Breitbart. What the users go on to share are almost all visuals. And this was a great piece of journalism by Ryan Broderick at BuzzFeed, where he actually showed US teenagers using technology like Google Forms, Google Docs, Dropbox, Discord, which is like Slack, to coordinate amongst themselves about trying to manipulate the French election. And they are actually seen in these chat rooms, which BuzzFeed got access to, saying, now we need people who are racist, but they can't look that racist. And we don't speak French, but it's okay, because we've created these meme shells. So in these kind of folders, they were creating these memes that people could just take and then drop into the Twitter sphere. So for me, when we look at what happened in France, what will continue to happen globally, the role of visuals and memes, which we can dismiss as, well, that's not really serious, are actually being used in, I talk about weaponized memes. For me, they're really concerning. The other thing I worry a great deal about are closed messaging apps. So I've just spent time in Asia. Every single Asian country has a different dominant messaging app, whether it's KakaoTalk in Korea, whether it's Viber in Myanmar, whether it's Line in Thailand and Japan. In terms of how we think about fighting mis and disinformation, not just political, there are huge concerns in these areas around access to information around science and health. The things that are motivating disinformation in these spaces, ethnic tensions, religious tensions. We at the moment are seeing this conversation. I live in New York, obviously, but it's, when I say obviously, the whole conversation in the US is through the Trump lens, and it's all about fake news sites for profit. And actually, globally, this is a significant issue that's not being discussed. In the Philippines, internet.org, which is Facebook's program, means that many people in the Philippines think the internet is Facebook. So we have people who have come to new technology without literacy skills in very polluted ecosystems and not quite sure what to do with that. So finally, there's a great initiative, and I think we just have to keep trying, keep having to try and test. This is in Colombia. To spread false news, people can actually send a WhatsApp message to an organization. They will debunk it for you, but only if you promise to spread it amongst your own networks. And certainly I met with somebody from India yesterday who said, it's all on WhatsApp. And he said the amount of disinformation on WhatsApp is appalling. And he's a journalist and said, I don't really know what we can do about it. But I leave you with this, which made me cry over the weekend almost. When the Macron leaks dropped, again, Ryan Broderick from BuzzFeed put this out. In the Caymans thread on 4chan, they linked a French journalist debunking the story because debunks are a form of engagement. So here's us spending a lot of time and energy over the last 10 weeks trying to debunk misinformation in the French election. And ultimately, we were clearly playing right into their hands. So I leave you not with solutions, but just to say this is complex and difficult, and we need to be very careful about what we actually do. So thank you.
Wow. Okay, thank you, Claire. That gives us 45 minutes of many, many topics to talk about. And as Claire pointed out, a lot of people have a stake in this, in solving this problem. And we have some representatives of exactly those actors with us here today. We have Isa Sonnenfeld, the director of the Google News Lab in the DACH region. Welcome, Isa. We have Roland Freund, the deputy editor-in-chief of the German press agency, the DPA, and Matthias Streitz, the editorial chief of product of Spiegel. Welcome all on stage. Whew. Claire, I will start with you, since you have given us just so much input to think about and worry about, quite frankly. So we have this whole ecosystem, we have bot factories and troll groups. We have a peer-to-peer network that has seemingly been kind of unknowing of how it was sharing all of this information, plus apparently state-sponsored hacks and leaks. Has the news ecosystem always been this messy?
So we have always had fake news, and we know this. Historically, it's been an issue for centuries. What we haven't had is the ease with which people can make and create manipulated content. So if anybody's got an 8-year-old, watching them with Photoshop or iMovie, it's much, much easier now to create this content. And the dissemination mechanisms, we've never had a way that information could spread this fast between trusted peers. So we've always had propaganda. Propaganda would come from traditional broadcasters. Now, propaganda comes from your mum and your best friend, but you don't realize you're trusting of those networks. So for me, it's the scale that's the disruption is at a level we've never seen.
So the ways of production, the dissemination methods, and the scale have sort of been different. What do you think was the tipping point of caring, though? When did we actually start? Was it
It was Trump.
Was it Trump completely?
I mean, I think globally, you hear people around the world saying, yeah, welcome to the party, America.
Exactly.
But I think even in Europe, I went to a presentation in the US by a Russian scholar who said it actually wasn't in Putin's interest for there to be an awareness of Russian implications in the US election, because Europe is the prize. Europe is what he wants. And actually, we have now woken up in Europe because I think the recognition of what happened in the US. But I do think, there's an organization in Brussels called EU versus Disinfo, and they've been tracking disinformation offline and online for the last 2.5 years. Only now are they getting called up by journalists, being like, tell us about this. I just think we weren't looking right under our own noses.
So you pointed out 7 types of dis and misinformation. Do you think there's any way for the average news consumer to distinguish between those kinds of mis and disinformation contents and journalistic, accountability-bound, genuine articles and content produced by people who do this for a living and have learned it as a profession? Is there any way actually to know?
So I think when I was talking about heuristics, there is a challenge that now we increasingly rely on these platforms for news, but previously you would go to a newsagent and you would give them money and you would buy Der Spiegel, and you would know in your head, I am reading trusted news. The problem now is when you get it in your timeline, it looks the same as everything else. And Mark Zuckerberg didn't deliberately come up with Facebook to create these problems, but ultimately he has, because our brains have not evolved to learn how to find and understand information when it all looks the same. So there is, I think, a technological solution where we can make it easier for brains on Google or Facebook to say, okay, this comes from an organization with a corrections policy and an ethics policy and a double sourcing policy, and we need to be better at explaining to audiences how journalism works, how the sausage is made, because many audiences don't understand the difference between the work that you do every day and a Macedonian teenager, because it looks the same.
Right. So segueing actually into tech companies, since you also mentioned that dissemination pathways were certainly a part of the, at least our awareness of the problem. Isa, how can you describe to us how Google has come to sort of see this as a challenge and as a problem? Why, as a tech company, has it been, same with Facebook and other platforms, been relatively slow to speak up? Or actually, would you say we weren't slow, we simply didn't recognize it before? What was your tipping point?
I think, as Claire pointed out, it's a super complex challenge and a super complex topic that involves tech companies, media companies, journalists, NGOs, but also the normal user on the other side to figure out how we define mis- and disinformation, but also how we define solutions to it. I think there's not a silver bullet to it. We have been, because Google Search and Google in general is information discovery business that we are in. And for many years, of course, we, I would say, misinformation and disinformation is nothing new. We've always been working on solutions against spam, and spam is part of the 7 types of mis- and disinformation. And we've done several changes to our products, to the algorithms, to the algorithm in the past weeks and months. But of course, we are in this together, and we need to find out what are the technical solutions. So, for example, we have made changes to the algorithm to show more quality content. We have introduced the fact-check tag to Google News. We have introduced the fact-check label actually in Google Search. So for user to see fact-checked information as soon as they open up search or as soon as they open up Google News. But as Claire also pointed out, I think it comes down to explaining users what is quality content, what is good journalism, and what is bad journalism and bad quality. And so I think because we are, on the one hand, investing in new features, product improvements, but also in initiatives like Crosscheck. We supported Crosscheck for France. We give trainings to journalists how to use tools, and I think we need to go beyond that to show users how to, for example, use search in a way that they by themselves can debunk and verify information. It's not easy because it's complex, both on search and on social networks, but there are certain layers of solutions, I think.
So you mentioned the fact check sort of label tag. Sorry, just so that the audience understands, that is then fact checked by whom? So if I
not by Google, but by media organizations or fact checking organizations. So it's basically showing or highlighting the work that journalists are already doing and fact checking organizations are already doing, and to give that a more prominent visibility and more visibility actually in Google News and search.
Right. So highlighting the work that journalists are already doing. I have Roland and Matthias here who will be sharing a mic, which is right here. Thank you. So Roland, tell me a little bit more about how this whole rise of awareness of the challenge has affected your daily operations. What have you changed in the newsroom? Were there any new roles? Were there new tasks? What has changed for you? How are you actually tackling this on a daily basis as a journalist?
I will come back to this in a second, but just a short remark to Claire, because you were talking about the different ways of misinformation, or the misinformation ecosystem, and you said there are new ways and new scale. I think the third thing, and it's important to mention that, is its speed and acceleration. So everything is live, and especially in the field of verification, this makes it so difficult, because it's like an open heart surgery broadcasted in television, and everybody who's watching it can comment on it. So, and this is so different and difficult for the media today. And that's now the point I have to answer your question. What has changed at our newsroom, for example? How do we react on this new challenge? You've got these 3 steps: monitoring, verification, and publishing. So these 3 steps are not new. That's what journalists did all the time. But what has changed in the social media age and regarding the social web is you have to react with new roles, with new tools. And that's what we are doing. So for the field of monitoring, we've got a special social web radar unit and a listening officer who's the head of this radar unit. So you might say, who in the times of social media, doesn't every journalist has to follow social media and watch it and be a kind of radar? Yes, that's true. If you are covering, for example, Angela Merkel, you have to follow her spokesperson, Steffen Seibert. That's right. Every journalist has to do that. But there are so many special tools and so many things not everybody can do. For example, the radar for breaking news, for user-generated content, for viral stories. So that's why we have this special unit. There's a second step regarding verification. We've got just announced a verification officer. He might be here as well. Yeah, Stefan Voss. He's the expert for this new team at DPA. It's the same thing again. So every journalist has to fact check, and but we need experts, especially for picture verification, for example, which is very difficult to do. Some are really easy fakes, but it's very difficult to verify some pictures, especially in war and criminal things. So this is the second step. And the third one is publishing. And publishing has changed very intensively. Some years ago, we just published the result of a research. At the end, one article, one story. Nowadays, I talked about live. We are publishing. Publishing is much more like a process. So every bit of information which we know, and sometimes what we don't know, we make this clear as well, we have to publish because it's a live situation. So publishing is not one article, one research result. It's much more process, a live process. So we've got these new formats, you've got them too, like what we know, what we don't know, and this is very important because otherwise you can't react on the live situation.
Matthias, what about you? We've had our fair share in Germany, even in the last couple of weeks and months, with quotes taken out of context or not even ever having been said by these people. Even now, already leading up to the election, we are definitely part of that ecosystem of mis and disinformation. What has happened at Der Spiegel to tackle this?
Well, at Der Spiegel, we have actually a long history of fact-checking with a large fact-checking department. And one of the challenges that we're facing is how do we bring that into a live environment where we have to fact-check things very fast. And we're trying to make that work with fact-checkers teaming up with staff writers on individual projects and doing debunks or fact-checks pretty quickly so that we can post them on social media or do an article on our web page. And but frequently we find that we're still a bit too slow because a lot of these things are going on social media outside of our own filter bubble, and then we have to use these monitoring tools in order to even see what stories are going viral, and then we have to react. And sometimes we find that, well, this is 3 days old. Do we do a debunk or not? This may be too late. If you have a live debate on television, you need to be quicker even. And so you have to do a balancing act there. The traditional fact checkers are saying, well, a fact check takes time, we can't do that in a day. And then on Facebook, a day is very, very long. So this is some of the newsroom challenges that we're trying to grapple with in front ahead of the election in Germany.
And maybe to stay on the topic of debunking, right? Because Claire has also actually pointed this out. You've been learning a lot with First Draft in terms of, does debunking actually work? What are the right headlines? Should they be questions or not? All of these comparisons and A/B tests that you've been doing. There are studies that show, people who are convinced of something will actually sort of harden their conviction when being shown a debunk of a myth, of a story. How do you handle that as journalists who generally try to do exactly that, look for the truth, and that often means debunking something? How do we deal with this? Is debunking actually the right answer?
Yeah, actually, we've tried a number of debunks, and then we've found, well, maybe we're just giving oxygen to the story. We're pushing it again on social media, like Macron leaks. Something is going to stick. Even those people who voted for him are going to believe he had an account on the Cayman Islands, maybe. So what we're trying to do is not debunk individual stories, but see what systems of misinformation or wrong beliefs are out there, and then sort of do a meta-analysis of that. So what actually did happen in Sweden without debunking an individual fake article, but just doing a piece about Sweden, or things like that. And then how do you pierce the filter bubble on Facebook or on social media to get that to the people who might be believing the disinformation? That's the other challenge, something where we have to work in tandem, I guess, with the platforms in order to achieve that.
So, can I just? Oh, sorry. Yeah. Go ahead.
Just let me add. I think this, the example of Sweden. This is a very good example for taking it and making something else out of it. Because I think the danger is that we are talking too much about fake news or misinformation system and all this stuff, and we don't talk about the great content we've got in the internet and the media as well. And debunking fake news or misinformation all the time is like, it's so reactive and it's not active. I'd like to sit in the driver's seat and to write our own stories, to do our own research, and this is a very good example how you can do that, and it's much more active, it's much more positive, and I think we should do more of this stuff.
So basically to offer the almost a counter narrative, or at least the sort of accurate narrative, right? But then I think there's a technical part to that, right? So if everyone's looking up what happened last night in Sweden, and maybe something did happen in Sweden, but let's say Google is then the platform where people search for Sweden, right? Is there part of it? Is there an algorithmic solution to this? You mentioned that Google has changed the search algorithm as well. Can you tell us a little bit more about the sort of tech aspect that you're taking for very specific large incidents, for example?
Of course. I mean, there are 100 million searches every day, and 15% of these searches every day are new. So people are typing in new search queries. And there were cases where we didn't show the high quality content on top, but we showed misinformation or content that was misleading. And we are not perfect, the algorithm is not perfect, but we, over the past years and actually over the past months, more actively than ever, have made changes to the search algorithm. So we updated the search rater guidelines. We are looking at bringing more high quality content to the top. And we also look into this fact check label or these fact check tags. But I think, so that's definitely a technical solution, and we are dedicated and committed to improve the algorithm going further. But there are also additional initiatives and additional things that we should do all together. Is, from my point of view, educating the user and really showing what good quality content is, where to find it, and how to differentiate. So initiatives like cross-check, initiatives like other debunking or misinformation initiatives are important to tackle that issue, but also there is this missing piece of educating the actual user, because most of the times they can't differentiate between good quality content and bad quality content. And then on the other hand, we also made changes to the ad policy. So in order to not play or give access to our ads business for fake news sites or for sites that are gaming our algorithm, and that's an important step. So there are definitely technical solutions, and we're working on it, but it takes the entire ecosystem to tackle that challenge, because as Claire said, it's not going to go away for the next 25 years.
Yeah, it's really disconcerting.
Yeah.
Claire, you also mentioned something, and you kept coming back to it, the power of visuals, right?
Yeah.
So we have journalists here who, we write a lot, we use a lot of words. You realized that a lot of this was actually spread in memes, in very succinct visual form. What do we do about that? Do we respond in kind? Do we all have to, now concentrate on tiny square visuals? And or are you saying we just need to, sort of realize that that's the main avenue through which we reach people? What do we do about this, the power of visual?
So we have to think much more creatively about how we do debunks. I'm going to come back to a second to some of the things you said. But when we do fact checks or debunks, and they're 800 words of really dry explanation, we're not really fighting fire with fire. So halfway through cross-check, one of our project editors said, can I have a go in creating some videos for Facebook? And we were like, actually, yeah, we know the Facebook algorithm loves videos, go. And so they did them, and they went gangbusters. I mean, partly because of the algorithm, but also because they were a much more fun, engaging way of understanding the context. And actually, ICFJ currently has a kind of a competition for people to come up with more engaging ways to do effective debunks. BuzzFeed are just hiring a video editor to come up with more. So I think we have to think about how we can use visual things. But just to quickly go back to debunks, I completely agree. Again, going back to our lazy brains, in order to debunk something, you have to, for a split second, accept the falsehood in order to override it. And so all the psychological literature says that when we do debunking, you actually have to put a new narrative in place for our brains to accept a new narrative. So when we do really dry debunks, which are just explaining why it's wrong, we're not giving our brains another way. So if we see 5 myths about vaccination and we list the myths and we say false, 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 our brain just remembers the myths. So there's a real science to how we do this effectively. And as journalists, I completely agree, we shouldn't just be playing kind of every single moment and reacting. But so to take the Hillary Clinton is a pedophile example, the US media, there was no way anybody was going to touch that because we all assumed nobody believed it. Actually, it had taken effect. So I think there's something about newsrooms having to understand the mis- and disinformation ecosystem to be much more strategic about how we tell narratives and how we, tell stories that aren't just reacting to a particular falsehood, but to say that's taking hold. People are searching for it in Google, or people are asking questions of one another. What does that mean for a news media? How can we create a new narrative to take the place of that existing one? And that's going to be a new form of journalism.
Well, and it's not just us. So let's don't forget about the user and the reader. You were talking about educating. Maybe it's a little bit more. We have to start a dialogue which is much more than just have comments under a news story, but a dialogue with the user. So how do you see this? Have you something you can give to the story? You can add some information. So this is how journalism is changing now. It's not one direction. So, for example, laugh out loud. You can't do this on your own and alone. You have to do this with your reader, with your user. You have to have a dialogue, and this is how journalism should change a lot. So it's not just debunking, clearing the misinformation and fact-checking. It's talking to the user, which is, I guess, very important for your...
Yeah, I was going to throw in another very huge topic, which is we have a crisis of belief in journalism, right? Yeah. We have a crisis of trust, and this is reinforcing this problem, and we have to deal with that at the same time. And we're facing, declining economics supporting journalism, which makes it harder still. So one thing that I think we have learned in the last couple of years is that we didn't listen to the audience a lot in terms of what is of concern to them. And when the refugee crisis began, we were still too much stuck within our Berlin politics bubble before we started going out into the field. So if you go where people feel the pain and then construct a new narrative instead of doing just a debunk, I think that is a much more powerful way in order to engage with them. And maybe that's going to go viral in its own right.
But
hopefully.
I think it's also interesting to look at some of the data you got from Crosscheck in France and the feedback you got from users, how they received the debunked news, where they discovered it, and how they actually also received, on the other hand, the misinformation or the misleading information. So I think looking at how users react to misinformation, and also to, on the other hand, the good quality information is the important part to then find solutions and consider how to reach those users with the right content, but also on the right platforms.
Yeah, because I was just going to say, on our videos I was just talking about, we'd get kind of 120 shares, and half of the reactions would be like the angry face on Facebook, and half the reactions would be like. And so it's not really academic, but we do have to kind of do an analysis of that. But like, were people happy because we'd done a debunk? But they were sharing them in large numbers, thus proving they clearly thought they wanted to share with their networks these videos. So it's really interesting.
To pick up on your point of sharing with one's network, you said a few weeks ago, you said one way to go about this is to make it socially unacceptable to share false news, right? So since we are talking a lot about social networks, social platforms, how do we create that social norm that it, amongst each other, it becomes socially unacceptable that my crazy uncle might, share something with me? Is this something that we then need to take, offline? Is this an analog activity of saying, dear Uncle Bob, never do this again? What do you mean by making it socially unacceptable to contribute to this ecosystem of the mis and the disinformation?
So when everybody became a publisher overnight via their mobile phones and Facebook, we never really said, this is a huge shift. You now have significant power, but you've had no ethics training. You've had none of the usual training that publishers have, no legal training. And so people just suddenly had this power. And I think we need to be better at saying our information streams are polluted. And for me, I talk about this like a global health crisis. We have global pollution of different scales and different types. But in that way, we all have to take a responsibility to say, if we retweet an old photo that's wrong, if we share a rumor without checking and just go, lol, it doesn't matter, then actually we're not helping because of the speed that every small thing each one of us does, it can escalate in a way that's unbelievable. So Craig Silverman talks about teaching emotional skepticism. So yes, news literacy programs are important, but all of us have been trained in verification skills. It doesn't matter that sometimes I'm tempted, I don't check, like my brain thinks this is too good to be true. So we have to be better at learning about our own brains to say, should I be sharing this? I say we shouldn't be allowed to share for 2 minutes. You shouldn't be allowed to share unless you've read it. All of this, you can press retweet without clicking on the link. But we should actually have some also kind of nudge technology which says, we're rubbish people, our brains are lazy and we're a bit rubbish. We actually need help to say, you know, that sounds like very paternalistic, but I think it's too easy to share misinformation and there's no embarrassment about doing it now. And we're not given the skills to talk to crazy Uncle Bob to say, Bob, actually, you know, and so instead we just email Snopes links to one another, and I don't really think that's the answer either.
Right. Emotional skepticism is the term you used, or Craig Silverman used. Emotional skepticism sounds like something, well, sounds quite emotional for journalism, right? We always try to keep this quite neutral. How do you feel about that? The sort of acknowledgement that people do share emotionally, that we react emotionally to journalistic pieces. Would you agree that there's something that might need to be, you know, not regulated? You said that that's quite paternalistic, but that we need to do about people's emotionality around journalistic pieces?
Look how uncomfortable they are.
I know, there's emotions. We are so
I don't want to stop emotions.
Yeah. Laugh out loud.
Yeah, laugh out loud. So I don't know whether this is the right way to do it. We need some media literacy, that's right, and social media literacy as well. But you will always have people who do bad things with this. So we say there's no good world that we have to achieve or where we can go to. We can make it a little bit better, but we have to be realistic as journalists as well. So we are not Superman. We can't fix the internet or the social web. So we are fact checkers. That's what we should do. This is our job. And this is our contribution to this problem. But I don't think that we are the ones to control the emotion of the people. Mm-hmm. And to be honest, journalism is something emotional as well. So we want to attract emotions. We want that people react to our stories. So I don't think that's the right way to do it.
It's a hard question, but I'm not against emotional journalism. Of course not. I mean, a lot of the great storytelling that we do is very emotional, or should be very emotional, and even short forms like a snap on Snapchat Discover, that can be very emotional, and that can be journalism too. And that can be very hardcore journalism that enlightens people. But then I think what we do need to do a better job is signposting what is what. People are very skeptical of some of the material that we publish because it mixes factual news and commentary. Mm-hmm. And that has been, a Spiegel way for a long time. Actually, since the magazine has been founded, but maybe that is something that we need to change now. Or maybe we need these very, very explicit signposts. This is an opinion piece, because on Facebook everything looks the same, but on Spiegel Online every article looks the same too. So that's an area where we have influence to change that.
Yeah. And I think also tools, easier and more simple tools for the normal user to do simple fact-checking immediately. So if I see a post or if I see a video, there should be 2 or 3 things I can do as a user, because I know that I have these tools at hand. So, I don't know, reverse image search, or for memes, of course that's more complicated because it's professionalized and professionally changed. But giving out tools or making tools easier and more simple to use for the actual user could and should definitely be another kind of puzzle piece to educate the readers and the users.
Since we have a very recent example that educated all of us, the French election, right? I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into that example. So you first draft launched Crosscheck in, I think, February 2017. Yep. We saw a major hack and leak right before the election, and yet, as a New York Times piece explained quite well yesterday, it didn't really land in the same way as it did, or as it seems to have done in the United States, certainly, with the hacking of the DNC. So I'd love to hear how you went through the French election and sort of guarded news around that. What you, Isa, the Google News Lab obviously tracks trends and Google Trends around the election as well. Claire, I'd like to start off with you though. Tell us a little bit more about what you learned, especially in preparation for events like that. So what were the top 3 things that we need to be doing ahead of, for example, the German elections in September?
So I think one thing that surprised us is that we expected maybe 6 to 10 stories over 10 weeks, and we had over 60. And I think we were surprised at the scale of manipulated photos, particularly. And I think, again, and I think you'll see this in Germany, because of the language barrier, a Macedonian teenager is not going to translate a story into French or German. There isn't the market for the Macedonian teenager. So it's less of that. But, we're speaking with a researcher in Germany who's showing some really dark stuff in German Facebook groups. Lots of anti-immigration, manipulated photos and videos. And so with the French cross-check, there wasn't like the knockout blow, Pope endorses Trump, which everybody wanted, like the story. But what we saw was this kind of drip, drip, drip of negativity against Macron, against refugees, against immigrants. And I think that's what we have to look at, is that if we, as journalists, are waiting for that knockout blow, we're missing like the low-level piece of this, which is the drip, drip, drip. And the Macron leaks, it was more about sowing confusion and distrust. And when we think about disinformation campaigns, that's what's going on here. It's not about, one particular thing. It's about over time, trust levels declining even further. This sense of, I don't know who to believe. The reason that Donald Trump calls us fake news is because he wants to say, I'm the only person you can trust. So that, for me, when we think about these projects, is I think we have to recognize the nuance and complexity, which is, it's over time. And I don't necessarily think across Czech Germany, we would do it in the same way if we did it. I think there's learning there, which is, it's understanding what's out there, almost to just understand from a monitoring point of view, this is happening in these groups. We shouldn't be giving oxygen, but we should know it's there. I mean, even the UK election, we've been finding some awful stuff on Instagram from far-right groups. And Instagram is not the place that people want to look. But again, I think we need to just be aware of the different types, where they're sitting, the influence they're having, rather than every time debunking one particular claim. But that's very early reflections.
Isa, what about the trends? What about at Google? How did you spend your last week, basically, right up until the election?
So, of course, it was not me, basically. It was David and Camilo, my colleagues in the Paris office, who were working with journalists, working with the first draft team, and looking at trends and looking at the searches people do and the questions people were asking about the candidates, about the election in general.
You say working with journalists, just so that we understand,
yeah.
do they actually, around those days, sit together and coordinate on the day? Or what do you mean by working with journalists?
So we started to send out almost daily newsletters with the latest Google Trends results and the most asked questions and the related searches who were actually most interesting, because if you look at Macron and the searches around Macron, then you will find out some of the topics that you as a journalist might have not covered yet, or topics that are coming up because misinformation is being spreaded over networks, social networks, and other sources. So Google Trends can be a detection for increasing topics that might be misleading, but it's also a good tool to kind of discover the pulse of what people are really thinking. And so we send out almost daily newsletters to, I think, around 640 journalists in France, who on the one hand looked at Google Trends from a research point of view, just to understand like what are people interested in and around the candidates and around the election, but then also from a storytelling point of view to give answers to these questions that users were asking. So it's one tool, useful for journalists, but also I think useful for everyone else, because Google Trends is a public website where you can, as you showed in your first lines, where you can type in one sentence or one word and actually see the spike. And we saw that during the US election for Hillary Clinton and alcohol. This spike, and it was related to a misinformation story that was spread over social networks.
Right. And then it becomes very interesting when, I think you mentioned this earlier, when people try to game the algorithm, right? Claire mentioned this before the panel, that right after the hacks and the leaks, people tried to sort of game the Google algorithm by basically posting across the net all of these, in English, by the way, not necessarily in French, posting about the leaks. You know, isn't it crazy that he has this account in the Cayman Island? Did you hear that he has his account in the Cayman Island? Because of course, if there are lots of pieces out there, at some point, you know, algorithmically, Google would pick it up, and so that is gaming the algorithm, which I'm sure you guys are now addressing, because that's part of the system. Yeah. What have you learned from the elections that you're now definitely preparing with for September?
I'm not sure we have learned enough, actually. I'd be very interested in learning about the French elections and what the findings were a couple of weeks further ahead, if you have the data. I'm not sure we have learned the lesson in Germany. There seems to be a fake sense of relief at the moment because we have declining AfD poll numbers and the refugee crisis is abating, and there is not a concerted effort in the way that there was in France against the disinformation ecosystem here. Every newsroom seems to be working on its own, and some have sort of stopped taking the problem seriously. A good colleague of mine said recently, I've spoken so much about fake news without ever having seen one. And that's because you're not on Facebook, or you're not having the right, well, you're having the right circle of friends on Facebook. So we need to get it out where it hurts. Otherwise, we're going to be unpleasantly surprised, or there is a potential for an unpleasant surprise, I think.
And maybe we should open it up for the audience for the last few minutes, but just a short remark on the collaboration. So when we were looking at the US elections or the French elections, we are still discussing here in Germany whether how intense media should collaborate in this fighting misinformation. And we are not so sure about it. I think collaboration is very good. I'm looking forward to a workshop we are doing in about 2 weeks. So which tools do you need? Do you use best practice and know-how and all this stuff? This is very important. I think we could do a lot more in this field. I'm not so sure about collaboration like having a website all together, all media all together. You mentioned this too. This might give the impression to the audience or to the people, all the legacy media all together. The so-called Lügenpresse is doing something, and they want to be something like a ministry of truth. So I think you did a very good job in France because you didn't have this discussion in France. This was great. I'm not so sure about it in Germany. This was what we discussed with all the media on a workshop some weeks ago.
Before I'll open it up to the audience, one more time to you, Claire, you mentioned rightly so that this has been a global problem, right? Just because we sort of realized this in the last year, apparently, doesn't mean that other countries haven't actually dealt with this for quite some time. One thing that you mentioned is closed messaging apps. Where else are we not looking yet? Where would you say, do we need to absolutely pay more attention? Not just tech companies themselves, not just in the newsrooms. Is there anything else where you would say everyone here in the audience needs to go home and be concerned about this and should, in America I would say call their representative, but where should we be looking?
I think closed messaging apps are the things that we're most going to be affected. And this is not a criticism of Mark Zuckerberg, but when he stood up on stage at F8 showing his wisp from a coffee mug and talked about augmented reality and how we could all pretend to be anywhere, I was like, are you kidding me? You've got this platform with a real problem and now you're making it another tool to make it easier. And if you've seen that video where you can basically manipulate somebody's voices, I've done enough presentations that somebody could manipulate a whole speech by me. There'd need to be a lot of waving of hands. But the technology already exists to manipulate whole speeches, both voice and video. That's Because then we're going to get to a point where people will say, I can't trust anything.
Yeah.
And that terrifies me. When you think, well, we don't know whether Angela Merkel said that.
Right.
I don't know where we go as a society when we get to that stage.
Yes.
I'm sorry this is so terrifying, but we should be terrified.
We should be terrified.
Yeah.
So, dear terrified audience, do you have terrified questions? Do we all need to go to therapy together afterwards? Let's have a working group. If somebody has a question, I'm sure we cannot be at yes right there with the glasses. Thank you. I do believe there. Actually, we do have to share this one.
Now you gave away the only mic,
right? The only voice.
Excellent. My name is Boris Anthony. I was the original architect of Global Voices about a decade ago.
Welcome. Yay.
Yeah. Thing I'm most proud of in my life. Anyways, a whole bunch of things in this struck me, and I don't want to be that guy who talks, so I'm just going to make maybe one comment, hyper condensed. The audience for journalism are not users. They're informed citizens. They are educated people who need to be educated more. It's not about only giving them technical tools to engage with the news. It's about giving them critical thought, the ability to engage with reality, to ask the right questions, to know, you don't have to be a trained journalist to know what's crap or not. You have to have a sense of what the world is. Oversimplifying, obviously. So that's what struck me out of this. This is a huge problem. The Ethan Zuckerman's collapse of trust. This is because you have politicians decimating culture. And so you turn, as a citizen, to journalism and you say, I don't believe any of this because I've been told not to. So how do we engage that? You guys are doing an amazing job, but who's got to do the job of fixing, in a solutioneering way, the education problem, essentially, right? Because we have all this information, now we need to learn how to deal with it. And it's not just a technical problem. Right. It helps, but it's not just that. So my question is that, who's got to do that work?
So we have a plea for media literacy here, I guess, or for more media literacy, more informed citizen. Also, look up Global Voices. Everyone's a fantastic coalition. You mentioned Ethan Zuckerman. He's at the MIT Media Lab, also a wonderful person to look up. Thank you. Would either one of my journalistic colleagues like to take that? Our audience are informed citizens, and we need to inform them more. You mentioned the dialogue. I think that's sort of what you refer to, right? Having a dialogue with our audience.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I really was very fond of that comment, but that would be another panel entirely, I guess. One where we have to speak about town hall meetings or education in schools, and are teachers qualified enough at the moment in order to combat this epidemic of disinformation, or are they not? Maybe they probably don't know enough, or most don't know enough about the ways this disinformation is spread. So yeah, it took a couple of years to have this mess explode onto the stage of world politics, and I'm not sure if that's gonna be fixed in 25 years. It's something we have to keep on working all the time.
But I mean, I agree with absolutely everything you said. I mean, trust in all institutions has dropped in a really serious way. And that's why I love Dana Boyd's quote, and why I put it up there, is that this is so complex and involves so many things, socio-cultural, and those things are really difficult to fix. But I do agree. I mean, even when, there's a kind of a journalistic conference, the way that people talk about audiences is so problematic. And if this was an open town hall meeting, people would be standing up and screaming at us, as they should do. The reason that journalists are struggling right now is because they see that people aren't putting them on a pedestal in the same way, because technology has allowed peer-to-peer sharing and expertise to travel. So we're focusing on disinformation here, but Global Voices and many other initiatives have just showed what happens when you connect people directly. So yeah, I could not agree more. It's not an easy solution, and that's why it's hard. And so everybody wants to be like, algorithmically, how can we solve this? Because nobody wants to say, how do we solve this from a socio-cultural perspective? So we don't ask those questions, but yeah, thank you for asking it.
And to make it even bigger and more complex, it's not just about media literacy and partners and dialogue, it's also about diversity. So if we want to understand how diverse our audience is, our partners, our dialogue partners out there, we have to be diverse in our media companies itself, and that's not where we are right now.
Absolutely. And Global Voices is actually a really good example of showing diverse voices. So maybe that's a fantastic end note. I can see people standing at the door. Thank you very much. Thank you to this wonderful panel, Claire, Isa, Roland, and Matthias. We'll be here right after if you want to come up for more questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.